Okay, so here we are. We get to start the fun stuff now with Marx. So the difficulty with talking about Marx is that he wrote so much, and not only did he write a lot, but a lot of his work is quite challenging. So most people, for example, academics included, don't even get through all 3 volumes of his masterwork, Capital, or in German Das Kapital, much less get to the dozens of other writings that he produced. Many of them published after his death, but still he published constantly during his life. So there's a huge amount of material to address with Marx. And none of it is particularly easy. So we're not going to be able to really get a comprehensive view of his work in a single lecture, of course. So I'll give you a little bit of extra stuff at the beginning that does not appear in the German ideology, which is what we're looking at today, but that nonetheless can be helpful in understanding how anthropologists have adopted his work and applied it to their own sort of methodological orientation. So one way to look at him is to look at his influences. This is a fairly common way of understanding where Marx is coming from and how he developed his kind of unique theoretical orientation. So he draws from 3 main sources. First were French socialists, those who predated him. Sometimes they're called utopian socialists. He used that term himself. So figures like Owen, Fourier, and Saint-Simon, none of whom should necessarily be familiar to you. That's not really the point. The point is there were these figures who were producing sort of templates for what a future egalitarian society should look like. And so he drew on them. Secondly, he drew on classical economists like Smith and Ricardo. And so one of the interesting features of his work then is that although he's critical of capitalism, he's significantly indebted to the major theoretical proponents of capitalism. Not in an uncritical way, but he recognizes the importance of some elements in their work. And then third is the German philosopher who predated him by not much, Hegel, and in particular, Marx drew on Hegel's dialectical philosophy. I'll say more about that in a moment. Now, very often we can get a sense of a scholar's direction in his or her critique of other work. This is a very common thing in academia for a couple of reasons. One is that many scholars sort of establish their place by critiquing other people's work. So that's how they sort of sketch out their space within the academy. Another reason is a less nefarious one, and that is that if you're claiming as a scholar to offer something new to your field, you have to be able to show how it's not just duplicating what other people have done. And so you, to some extent, are forced to distinguish yourself by something like critique of others' work. In Marx's case, it's a challenging project to figure out where he's coming from through his critique, because he uses each of those 3 sources of inspiration to criticize the others. This is a funny thing. He's simultaneously then critiquing and preserving all three of them. So he maintained the egalitarian aspiration of utopian socialism, for example, but he criticized it for being undemocratic. He thought that if you're trying to create a blueprint for the new society, then there's a way that you are not giving the members of that society or the people who will become members of that society their autonomy. You're not giving them a say in the development of that new society. You're just giving them a blueprint and saying, follow this. So there's a way that he thought that that was undemocratic. But also, he thought that there was kind of an ahistorical view of social change there, as if you could simply produce an ideal society in blueprint, in abstract, and then just layer it over what currently existed. And he thought that that was not the way that history actually unfolded, and that social change occurred. And so we'll see in the German ideology that he wants to start with not the blueprint, but actual living human beings, and understand what it is that generates social change in order to figure out how to organize people democratically to produce the change that they want, rather than the change that's being sort of prescribed for them. Now, from classical economics, he took the labor theory of value. This was a very, very important feature of his work, especially, as I say, his masterwork, Capital. The labor theory of value in its simplest form, so I'm giving you a gloss here, this is not a detailed account of it, but in its simplest form, the idea is that material in the world doesn't have any economic value until humans apply labor to it. So if you think of an apple tree, then the apples on that tree have no economic value until somebody applies labor to them. So if I water the tree, if I do the work of making sure that it's free of pests, or simply when I pick the apple from the tree, I'm applying my labor to the apple. And that's what endows it with a certain amount of economic value. That's what gives it economic value at all, in fact. But it's also why I am the one who has a claim on that apple. Why? Because it's my labor alone that has been applied to this apple, or to the tree, or what have you. So he takes that from classical economics. This is something that you find from John Locke's work, through Adam Smith's work, through David Ricardo's work. You see this labor theory of value is consistent through them. And Marx, he's persuaded by that. He thinks that there's that is the clearest sense of where we get economic value. But he thinks that that notion needed to be anchored in a dialectic model from Hegel, so that we can free ourselves from the idea that goods have value in and of themselves, or that one thing has value relative to another thing. And this he, at one point in Capital, would call fetishism, where it's as if when you're fetishizing an object to think that it has intrinsic economic value, then you're allowing yourself to forget, in a sense, that all that it is congealed labor. Right? That without the labor, there would be no value in the object at all. Possibly no object in the case of things like cars or computers. And so he wants then, through dialectical model that recognizes both that labor is what produces economic value, and that the social arrangement of labor is what allows some people to appropriate value from the labor of others. So that's the historical engine, if you want. He wants to keep those things in view so that we don't fall into this trap of fetishizing goods to think that goods only have value with respect to other goods, rather that they have value because of the labor congealed in them. So then, dialectics, what is that about? This is his major inheritance from Hegel. And as we see in the German ideology, he criticizes Hegel for being an idealist. So where he thinks the economists are appropriately material, or materialist, but inadequately dialectical, he thinks that Hegel is an important contributor by offering the model of dialectics, but that he's inadequately material. He thinks that Hegel is an idealist. So in his view, and there's good reason to think this, Hegel's view of history is that it is the progress of ideas rather than the progress of material conditions. So then he wants to take the dialectical model, this is Marx now, he wants to take the dialectical model but materialize it, and rather than allowing it to remain an idealist model. Okay, so then we're still left with the question of the dialectic. Now, this is, it's a very, very complex concept. Hegel is an elusive writer. Hegel was also very prolific. He wrote a tremendous amount, and he wrote, like Marx, he wrote very long books that are very complicated. So what I'm giving you here again is just the thinnest gloss of what dialectics are about, but hopefully it will be enough to orient you to certain points in the German ideology later on. So in Hegel, we could approach it like this. We have a concept of something. Doesn't matter what it is, any concept. It seems like it's stable, like we know what we mean when we use the concept. But then as we start to use it, or as we start to investigate it or reflect upon it, we start to notice that there are cracks and contradictions in the concept. So it's producing its own contradictions. And through this, it starts to undermine itself. This is what Hegel calls sublation, at least in the translation into English. It's called sublation. So that it both cancels itself and preserves itself, throwing itself into crisis. You need then a higher order resolution or solution to resolve the crisis. We'll see this when we get to the German ideology, that Marx thinks that this is how history moves, that each new model of society or of social relations that displaces an old one both bears within it the older contradictions from the older model, but in resolving them produces its own new contradictions. And so this is the trick, is that every solution for a previous set of contradictions resolves those contradictions but produces its own. And so you get this movement to, in Hegel's view, higher and higher orders of concepts. And so Marx will think that this is happening materially, not just in ideas, though there's an important relationship between material and ideas, as we'll see. So then Marx shifts from ideas to the material basis of social relations, showing that the history of social change is one class resolving the contradictions of an existing social order through revolution, but then developing its own contradictions. So that if we think just of the most relevant case for Marx, say the French bourgeoisie, so capitalists, overthrow the feudal order that preceded it, because the feudal order was rife with contradictions and so unsustainable in the light of the bourgeois revolution, but that then the bourgeoisie, by introducing capitalism, produced their own contradictions. And then the socialist or the communist revolution, Marx calls them communist throughout the German ideology, will be the revolutionary force that will displace the bourgeoisie, that will displace the capitalist system. Another way of approaching Marx then is to think of sort of three large areas of interest. So that we have the Marx of alienation, we'll get to that later. The materialist Marx, that's the one who's of most interest to our methodological questions for this course, and the Marx of class struggle and exploitation. We're going to focus primarily on the materialist Marx, but it's worth understanding a little bit about class and exploitation because that's an important motivator for a lot of the work that is done in anthropology in the materialist vein. It's often called political economy. All right, so his primary concern is with capitalism. He takes a historical view of other modes of society, what he'll call modes of production, but capitalism was the one that really preoccupied him. In capitalism, he sees two classes. Capitalists, or as I just said, the bourgeoisie, they own the means of production. So the means of production, capital, the factories, the machinery, whatever you can use to make other things, right? So the manufacturing capability. And on the other side, you have the workers. So they're the ones who work on capital. They work on machinery owned by other people, but they don't have capital of their own. They have only their labor to sell. And this is important because this is determinative of who's able to keep the surplus value that's produced on the capital by the workers. We'll see what surplus value means in just a moment. Marx understands the relationship between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat through the concept of exploitation. And this is on the facade of the Toronto Stock Exchange, and it's interesting mostly because you can see here we have this capitalist or an entrepreneur with his bureaucrats marching behind him, sliding his hand into the pocket of the worker who's the one who's actually producing the value. How they managed to get this onto the facade of the stock exchange is a story I don't know, but I think it's very clever that they did. In any case, so the capitalist and the worker negotiate workers' wages. So you can see this, for example, if you think of a union negotiating with an employer to settle a wage. That's the kind of negotiation that sets the wage. In the absence of a union, it might just be the way that the market establishes a certain range of wages for certain kinds of workers, so that then the worker's ability to negotiate the wage is constrained to that range, whatever it might be. But the trick is that it's the worker's labor that produces value, and in fact it produces more value than the wage that the worker is paid. So say a worker labors for 10 hours per day and produces 100 units in value. Doesn't matter what the unit is right now. It could be monetary, but it doesn't need to be. So let's just use a stand-in and say units. So you produce 100 units of value in 10 hours of work. But the wage that the worker is able to negotiate is 50 units per day. The capitalist alone then can claim the surplus value, the value above and beyond what the worker gets paid for the value that the worker produces. So another way to think of this is that the capitalist has a claim on the entire 100 units of value, but then pays the worker 50 units of value of that total value that he or she has produced. Now, Marx has a formula to calculate exploitation, and that is that he takes the surplus value, the value above and beyond the worker's wage that the worker produces, and divides it by what he calls variable capital, the wage that the worker gets paid. So the formula is E equals S over V. Exploitation equals surplus divided by variable capital. So in our example, the surplus is 50, right? 100 minus 50. The variable capital is 50, that's the wage. So then exploitation is 100%. 50 divided by 50, 100%. There are ways, though, that the capitalist can increase the rate of exploitation. So one might be lengthening the workday without paying the laborer more for the longer workday. So then it's not an hourly wage, it's a daily wage. Let's say our factory owner, adds 5 hours to the workday. So it's not a 10-hour workday, now it's a 15-hour workday. What is the new rate of exploitation? Well, the total value produced will now be 150. The wage remains the same at 50. So surplus is 150 minus 50 equals 100. The formula, E equals S over V, is 100 over 50, is 200%. So that by increasing the length of the workday and holding wages constant per day, the capitalist is able to double the rate of exploitation. Or not the rate of exploitation, sorry. The rate of surplus value, exploitation. Another way to increase productivity of labor is through technological innovation. So let's say previously you're a yarn spinner and you've been working just on a manual loom, or a weaver working on a manual loom. But then, so you can get a certain amount done on a manual loom in that period of time. But then a mechanical loom doubles the productivity of the weaver's labor. The weaver can now, with the mechanical loom, produce twice as much value in the same period of time. And this arguably is exactly what happened when the English introduced the mechanical loom and started to dramatically threaten the livelihood of Indian weavers, India being a colony at the time, because the mechanical looms were so much more efficient. So now you have a worker who produces in the same 10-hour shift 200 units of value instead of 100 units of value. What's the new rate of exploitation? Well, total value is now 200. Wages are the same at 50, so 200 minus 50 is 150. That's the surplus value, the value produced above and beyond the wages that the worker gets. And so the rate of exploitation is now calculated as 150 divided by 50, or 300%. So you can see there are different ways of increasing exploitation. And the thing that's important for Marx then is that on the one hand, this is calculable. It's not a vague idea. He has a very precise idea of what exploitation is. And secondly, that this is characteristic of the relations of production in capitalism. So capitalism is the mode of production And this formula gets at how within capitalism, the capitalist is the only one who can lay claim to the surplus produced by the laborer, and therefore is in the position to exploit the worker. Okay, now we can get to the German ideology. Oh, and it's just worth noting in passing here that Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote this. They wrote the Communist Manifesto together and a number of other things. They were great collaborators. And when Marx was in London, where he spent a significant portion of his life, Engels was really responsible for sort of keeping Marx, who was quite poor at the time, fed and clothed. And so on the one hand, they were great intellectual collaborators, but they also had quite a deep friendship that allowed Marx to do so much of the work that he did. Now, Marx's insistence on a materialist method demands an account of how material surroundings affect ideas, right? So how it is that ideas are related to their material conditions of production. In the case that he's looking at, what the relation of German philosophy, he's thinking of Hegel here, is to German material reality. So he summarizes his method like this. We start from real premises with real individuals, not ideal individuals, real individuals. We look at the activity of these individuals and their material conditions, those existing before them and those they produce by their activity. So the first premise that he works with is the existence of living human beings, not the existence of ideas, but of actual flesh and blood human beings. And then the first fact that you have to establish is their physical organization and the resulting relation to the rest of nature. So what are the social arrangements in the material production of their livelihoods, and how then that social organization of production relates them to the rest of nature, the raw materials that they use in order to sustain themselves. So then he thinks that one of the key distinctions between humans and animals is that humans produce their means of subsistence. Animals, he thinks, don't produce their means of subsistence, so that their relationship to the natural world is significantly, categorically different from humans who produce their means of subsistence. The writing of history, then, is the writing of the modification of humans' natural bases through human action. So how humans, through producing their own means of subsistence, change the basis on which they live, and on which they, therefore, produce. Their physical organization conditions how they produce their means of subsistence. So whatever your current conditions are will determine or influence how you produce your own means of subsistence. If you think of it in this, I think, fairly straightforward way, you can see that when I was young, for example, and home computers were quite rare, they weren't a necessary part of how we produced our means of subsistence. What's happened now, though, of course, is that virtually everywhere around the globe, the way that we produce our subsistence is highly technological, highly computerized. And so you can see that change just over a single person's lifespan, of how the organization of the conditions under which we sustain ourselves are quite different than what they were a couple of generations ago. So probably the most straightforward way to think of this is just through technological change. As technologies change, the physical conditions of how we produce our subsistence changes, and that brings with it changes in social relations. It brings with it changes in the organization itself. The key here, though, is that by producing our means of subsistence, we produce our actual material life. So this is not something simply determined by nature, but it's determined by nature and the way that we organize ourselves and organize our labor to appropriate nature and sustain ourselves. He says, the nature of individuals thus depends on the material conditions determining their production. So I think that this is a fairly clear statement of his materialist orientation. That it's not ideas changing over time that produce the changes that he's talking about, social changes and productive changes. It's the changes in material conditions. So both inter and intra-national, between nations and within nations, relations depend on the stage of production of nations. Stage of production having to do with the material conditions and social relations of economic production. The stage of development is shown by the degree of division of labor, which is a property relation. So by division of labor, we see that he's already drawing on a concept to try and explain how it is that some people produce value and other people don't produce value but are able to draw on the value produced by others. So this is before he's developed his notion of exploitation, his theory of exploitation. But already he has the beginnings of an idea that property relations within any given mode of production will allow some members to live off the labor of others or live off the value produced by others. So each new productive force creates a further division of labor. As the nature of production changes through human innovation, through human changes in social organization, you get a further division of labor so that the producers of value become more and more removed economically from those who appropriate it. Marx describes several stages of development in this division of labor, which he also calls different forms of ownership. Later he'll call them modes of production, but for now he's calling them different forms of ownership, division of labor. These concepts are all related to one another, but he just elaborates them in different ways and in different language at different moments of his intellectual production. So right now he's talking about division of labor. We'll see when we get to Durkheim, that Durkheim also has an idea of division of labor as producing social change. Their ideas don't overlap with one another exactly, because for Marx, the important thing about division of labor is not that different people are doing different tasks, but rather that the way that the labor is divided, some people are producing most of the value but not able to claim it all. Others are producing little or no value, but are able to appropriate it. So he points, for example, to the emergence of a priestly caste or class, in which the priests do no real economic labor, but are able to sustain themselves by appropriating the value produced by others. So that's the kind of division of labor that he has in mind. Okay, so the three that he looks at are tribal. The three models of property are three divisions of labor: tribal, communal and state ownership, and then feudal, before getting to capitalism. The important thing for our purposes is not to go through in detail the characteristics of each one of these. The important thing is to get a sense of how he sees the movement from one to the other. The dialectical method is how he understands, how he goes about making sense of these shifts. So each one of these stages produces its own contradictions in property relations. These are the contradictions that he thinks are at the heart of all historical and social change. Contradictions in property relations. The new social formations that resolve those contradictions, as we've seen before, introduce new contradictions. So contradictions that didn't exist in the past social relations or property relations, because the current contradictions weren't elemental in that previous set of relations. Rather, that as the new set of relations resolves the previous contradictions, it creates new ones of its own. Our analysis then must empirically show the connection of the social and political structure with production. Again, with this, he's pushing back against Hegel. In Hegel's model, or in Hegel's view, history and social change are about the movement of ideas throughout time, and how the contradictions within any given set of ideas propel people and propel history forward by producing the resolution to the contradiction in those ideas. For Marx, again, he thinks that idealist approach is baseless, that the base, in fact, is production. And so we need to take the dialectical method, but attach it to production rather than attaching it to ideas. Social structure, then, is not a question of how we imagine ourselves to be, but how we really are, producing materially under definite limits, say technological limits, resource limits, that are independent of our will. So it's not that we're working under conditions of our own choosing, but rather we find ourselves in the conditions that we're in, that we've inherited, and we produce within those conditions. Doesn't matter how we imagine ourselves to be, though the reality of those conditions imposes itself upon us and compels us to organize our production with respect to those conditions, no matter what we would will them to be. Marx concludes then that thinking, conceptualizing, so forth, are the outcome of humans' material behavior, rather than our material behavior being the outcome of our ideas. He characterizes his method like this: we do not set out from what men say, imagine, conceive, nor from men as narrated, thought of, imagined, conceived, in order to arrive at men in the flesh. We set out from real, active men, and on the basis of their real-life process, we demonstrate the development of this ideological reflexes and echoes of this life process. And so he concludes, life is not determined by consciousness, but consciousness by life. This is a provocative idea, right? He's saying that life is not what we will it to be, but rather our consciousness is the product of the conditions of our lives. So then the fundamental conditions of history, Marx says, are first, producing the means to satisfy our biological needs. It makes sense, right? If we don't produce the means to satisfy our biological needs, we cease to exist. So that's the first order thing. Second, the satisfaction of these needs produces new needs. So you could imagine as we, say, become better at fishing, there's an impetus to generate new methods of fishing, so that if our stocks become low, we're able to catch more. Or to go back to the example that I was giving before, in the past, say in the 1800s, our needs were of a certain technological sort. Computers were not on the horizon yet. Now, in order to satisfy our biological needs, we need to have things, we have requirements given our current state that we didn't have in the past. Computerization is a major part of that. For many of us, having cars would be. A lot of people, for example, would not be able to get to work if they didn't have cars. And so that is now a need that we have that we didn't used to have. And that need is the production of past economic or productive changes. So the satisfaction of our current needs produces new needs. The family is the first social relationship through which humans reproduce themselves. I think he means this both as a matter of history, that the family was the original thing, but also as a matter of contemporary life, that reproduction of the family is the first order way of humans reproducing themselves. So that this is something that sustains itself through all human social organizations. And then finally, the reproduction of labor is therefore natural and social. So that there is a way then that the family and the reproduction of the family is just a natural thing. That this is common to all say mammals, but that its organization and the organization with respect to how we produce and the needs that we have and the needs that we need to satisfy are also social in nature. So that we can't say either that we're entirely natural, responding, say, reflexively to our natural needs, or that we're entirely social and that nature has nothing to say about how we satisfy our needs and what our needs are, but that they're both simultaneously. Marx then focuses on the division of labor as originating with the division of material and mental labor. With this, we get the first contradiction, that those who produce value and those who enjoy the production of value diverge from one another. So again, you can take the example that I offered before. You could think of, say, priests or shamans or what have you, who are not major producers of economic value, but are consumers of economic value beyond what they themselves produce. So then you're getting this splitting apart into two groups, those who produce value and those who consume value that they don't produce. Private property and the division of labor are, therefore, expressions of the same thing. They are conceptually the same thing. And by private property, though, it's important to point this out and to keep it in mind whenever we're thinking about Marx when he talks about property. he's not talking of property, especially when we get to his later works like Capital, in terms of belongings. He's thinking of it as productive property, capital, so that when he talks about the proletariat being propertyless, he's not saying that workers have no belongings. He's not saying that workers don't have homes, for example, but he's saying that they don't have capital. So again, to go back to the example that I was just giving, he would look at the contemporary world and say that for many workers in the US, let's just keep it simple by looking at the US. In the US, many, probably most workers require a car just in order to be able to work at all, to get to and from their jobs. So the cars belong to them. It is a belonging, but it's not property because it's not producing economic value. It's just one of the requirements of being able to work at all. So this is when he's talking about property, then he's really got in mind capital, what you can use to produce economic value. The product of labor then becomes separated from the producers, the laborers. You don't need to think of capitalism only to get this. So you could think of, in the feudal era, the way that value was extracted from peasants, for example, is that the peasants would have the land that they worked. They would be the only people applying their labor to that land. They would produce whatever crop they produced, but they would then have to give a certain portion of that product to the Lord. The Lord hasn't worked in order to produce that value, the peasant has, but the Lord has a claim on a certain portion of the harvest. And in that way then, the producer, the laborer, the producer of value, becomes separated from a portion of what he or she has produced. This product then, the product of labor, becomes something others can claim for themselves. The division of labor, Marx argues, with the division of labor, which is not something that you see in what he calls primitive communism. So a moment in our distant past when everybody did more or less the same things and was able to maintain the product of their labor, but through the fact that everybody distributed the goods of their work throughout an entire community. So if you think of, say, hunter-gatherers, I think this is the kind of primitive communism that he has in mind. But then that's not what we're talking about now. So with the division of labor, human action appears like an alien power operating on us. They appear to be anonymous economic forces acting on us, not of our own making. So they seem to be just kind of like natural laws, the law of the market, the law of supply and demand. Marx thinks, though, that these forces are entirely of our own making. In fact, we produce these conditions and these forces. So property is not a fact of nature, but a product of social relations. To abolish the private property identical with existing social relations is to dissolve the power these forces hold over us. So this is an important point, right? Because if we don't understand the social change as a change in property relations brought about by social forces, then it becomes mysterious to us. But, Marx is arguing, once we can see that the conditions that we produce socially are social in nature, that property is a product of social relations, then we can also see how they can be revised through social relations, like revolution. Okay, and so then, as he says, when we abolish one set of property relations, they lose their hold over us. But because he's a dialectician, he won't say that there aren't new forces that exert a new hold over us, just the old ones no longer do. So that the relationship of lord and serf becomes abolished, it evaporates, it dissipates with the bourgeois revolution, but now we have the relationship of capitalist to proletariat, or capitalist to worker. So it's a new set of property relations. And this brings us to his earliest work on alienation. So the current state of society, he thinks, is one of alienation. And dissolving the current state of society will bring alienation to an end. So we have, very helpfully, a nice video to explain this to us.
Believed that work, at its best, is what makes us human. It fulfills our species' essence, as he put it. Work allows us to live, to be creative, to flourish. However, the reality in 19th century Europe was that work destroyed workers, particularly those who had nothing to sell but their labour. To the mill and factory owners, a worker was simply an abstract idea with a stomach that needed to be filled. The workers had no choice but to toil long hours for a pitiful wage. What was worse, their labour alienated them. Alienation is a disorienting sense of exclusion and separation. Factory labour, under capitalism, alienated the workers from the product of their labour. They made stuff they couldn't afford to buy, which disappeared to shops in far-off places, to make money for people who paid them next to nothing. The factory production line split jobs into meaningless tasks that made the hours at work tedious, empty and bleak. They became cogs in a gigantic machine. Workers lived for the few hours at home when they could eat, sleep and relax. The rest of the time, they weren't fully alive. This work also alienated them from each other. The only way out of this drudgery, Marx argued, was for the workers to organize and revolt. They needed to seize the means of production, leading to his famous rallying cry, "Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains."
Okay, so bringing about the end of alienation, he thinks, relies on two premises. First, the contradiction of a world of wealth alongside the great mass of people who remain propertyless in the sense of capital. So that you have this great division created, a contradiction between tremendous wealth held in the hands of a few people and the great mass of people who actually are the ones who produce that wealth, but who remain propertyless and therefore are in a position in which they must sell their labor if they want to survive. It's their only means of sustaining themselves. And then the second is the development of productive forces. So the development through historical, material, and technological change of the productive forces to allow ever greater exploitation of labor. This conception of history depends on our ability to expound the real processes of production, starting out from the material production of life itself, and to comprehend the form of intercourse, social relations is what he means, connected with this and created by this mode of production as the basis of history. From this, he arrives at the conclusion that circumstances make men just as much as men make circumstances. So again, this is his nice dialectical move to say that there's this interplay between our material circumstances and how we produce the material circumstances in which we live and labor. So then, it's not criticism, but revolution is the driving force of history. Again, he's trying to distinguish himself from Hegel here. So saying that it's not the generation of ideas, of new ideas, that change history, but revolution, concrete humans engaged in revolutionary activity. Why? It's because the ideas themselves derive from classes rather than classes deriving from ideas. In every time, in every historical epoch, the ruling ideas are the ideas of the ruling class. The class that rules the material force of society is simultaneously the ruling intellectual force. So what ideas do they produce? Well, he says ruling ideas are the ideal expression of the dominant material relationships. It's the dominant material relationships grasped as ideas. So that if you look at the feudal era, ideas like honor were the paramount ideas. Why? Because they were a reflection of the ruling class, the interests of the ruling class at the time. And you can also see, by extension, how maintaining the idea of honor and dignity allowed the ruling class, the lords, the aristocracy, to produce the sort of social narrative that justified their positions at the top of society. When they get thrown over by the bourgeoisie, though, what do they get thrown over with? Well, the change in material relations is now one that is best served by the freedom of the individual to produce, to employ wage laborers, to free serfs from their serf landlord relations, so that they can now become wage workers, so that the ideas then that the bourgeoisie promotes as a reflection of the revolutionized social relations are ideas like freedom. So an idea like freedom then displaces ideas like honor, not because they're better ideas, but because they reflect the new property relations that through revolution have displaced the old the old social relations. Not gotten rid of them, not destroyed them, right? But has displaced them. By extension, then, revolutionary ideas presuppose a revolutionary class. Another way of putting this is to say that without a revolutionary class, you don't get revolutionary ideas. They can only occur with the existence of a revolutionary class. As an example, then, the ideals of the bourgeoisie include political equality against aristocratic inherited privilege and presented as a universal ideal. Why? Because political equality is what allows them to claim the reins of political power, reflecting the idea that everybody then has his or her own choices to make. His or her own fate is left up to the individual. It's not something that you inherit from birth. It's something that you make or fail to make on your own. This is a powerful idea when what you need to do is employ laborers, so that if you can justify the employment of laborers and the exploitation of laborers by the removal of the surplus value that they produce, you can say, well, they're in the position they deserve, that each one of us makes his or her own life, is responsible for his or her own life. And that's why we are politically equal, because nobody gets to simply claim a position through inheritance. You have to earn it. Marx's interest, then, is in the conditions of production of ideas. So then revolutionizing those conditions allows revolutionizing ideas and ideals. He argues that true freedom can only arise under material conditions in which everyone, not only propertied, as with capitalism, can enjoy it. Thus, the idea of freedom under communism is a different notion of freedom from the bourgeois idea of liberty. For one thing, it's not just political in nature. It doesn't leave the economic aside as if politics and economics have nothing to do with each other. So here's what we can see. Marx sees social intercourse, or relations of production, to be characterized by its specific oppositions and contradictions. Each epoch is characterized by particular relations of production then, and what characterizes those epochs, those different relations of production, are the oppositions and contradictions within them. The opposition of serf and lord and bourgeoisie in one moment, the opposition of bourgeoisie and laborer in a different moment. That's what characterizes these relations of production. Down the road in his work, he'll call this mode of production, but for now he's calling them social intercourse. These oppositions, are material in nature. So it's not about having different ideas, different opinions than one another, but rather differences in our material conditions having to do with production and the appropriation of what we produce by others. They progress dialectically to concentrate wealth and increase the ranks of the propertyless, so that over time, he thinks, you get a greater and greater concentration of wealth and property, capital, in fewer and fewer hands, and a larger and larger body of propertyless people, workers, laborers. And that this is the dialectical progress of history, in concrete terms, not in ideas, but in concrete terms. So, can we see what he's talking about with respect to the US? Well, we can see that the disconnection between productivity and compensation has grown over time. So that from the time of Nixon, where increases in productivity, through to Ford really, where increases in productivity were more or less followed by increases in hourly compensation, from that point onward, we get this ever-increasing divergence, a divergence really exaggerated under Reagan and everyone following, so that our productivity has skyrocketed since the 1980s, where wages have remained more or less flat since then. And so this you can see then. There's this greater and greater appropriation of surplus. Why? Because all of this gap falls to the hands not of workers who are down here, but to capitalists. And we can probably account for a lot of that through technological changes, because as I said toward the beginning, technological changes can increase productivity in a way that the surplus increases, but wages, as we see down here, wages don't really change. So that the rate of exploitation increases with technological innovation. And we can also see that the difference in people's actual income has sort of stagnated over here, right? So over that same period, it sort of stagnated. And finally, we can look at, if we really want to get a clear sense of the concentration of wealth into fewer and fewer hands, we can see that the top 1% of Americans in terms of income has just diverged completely from the bottom 90%. Their income, rather, has remained more or less flat since the late 1980s, whereas the income of the top 1% has grown by 138% since 1980. Only a 15% increase over here. So then this is Marx's point, is that you get the greater and greater concentration of wealth in a few hands, and fewer hands as time goes by, and you get more and more propertyless, in the sense of capital, propertyless people. And then you can also adjust this for wages in terms of inflation, to show that wages over from 1960 through to 2009, with the orange dots, have sort of not been able to keep up with inflation. Inflation has increased slightly more quickly than wage increases. To make the point then that in real terms, people are earning less than they were in the 1960s. Another way that you can look at this is to see that massive organizations, your Walmarts and Costco's of the world, have increased their portion of the market at the expense of single location retailers, so that mom and pop shops are progressively getting squeezed out of the market by the Walmarts of the world. What does this mean? It means that the owners, say, of family businesses, are increasingly unable to compete in a market dominated by massive chains. Again, Walmart is the paradigm example here. So when they're squeezed out of business, what do? They run out of capital. Who do they become then? Well, they become members of the proletariat. They have nothing to sell but their labor. They are without capital, without property. And so the net result is that the ranks of the propertyless swell as the ranks of the capitalists shrink. You have fewer capitalists with owning more capital and you have more workers owning less and less. Well, nothing, in fact. Only their labor. And this is the argument that Marx wants to make.